The infirmary on Zareth Prime had a way of swallowing sound. Even the vents breathed softly, as if the walls feared to disturb the grief they kept inside. Through the high windows, the twin red moons bled a bruised light over steel cabinets and empty gurneys, smearing the room with a color that looked too much like old wounds. Rourke scrubbed his hands at the basin until the water went pink and then clear, until the day's failure slid off his knuckles and spiraled down the drain. He was reaching for a clean towel when the perimeter gates groaned like an animal being forced to kneel. The first scream came from a medic in the atrium. The second was the metal itself, protesting the weight that pushed through. Rourke stepped into the hallway and saw fear crystallize on every face as guards raised their pulse pikes and drones zipped up to form a hovering barricade. In the center of the attention, stumbling under a load no one should have to carry, came a young woman in travel-worn robes, shoulders squared against despair. Chains of dried salt clung to her sleeves, crackling as she moved. Her boots left faint pearlescent prints on the polished floor. Behind her, half-dragged and half-guided, the albino dragon scraped his claws over tile. He was immense even in collapse, a cathedral of bone and silk-white hide now ruined by a plague of black barnacles clamped into every ridge and seam. They pulsed like diseased hearts, each one weeping in ink that hissed when it kissed the air. The beast's wings, wilderness woven into flesh, hung in ribbons. With every breath, a rattle like broken bells rolled through the hall, and the smell salt iron and something ancient torn open hit Rourke's mouth and made him taste winter. No one moved. The drones calculated quarantines. The guards thumbed safeties they hoped they would never have to flip. The medics, bright with training and sterile with protocol, froze, because contagion was history's most faithful executioner, and the barnacle plague had emptied cities. The woman's voice arrived hoarse and formal, like a prayer recited for the last time. "Please, he is my father." She did not weep. The streaks on her cheeks had long since dried into maps of where sorrow had already traveled. Rourke walked forward, and the drones shifted to warn him back. He ignored them and kept going until their lenses stared into his face and recognized authority they weren't coded to parse. He smelled the sea in the dragon's breath and something else beneath it, an algorithm of rot that had learned to sing. The woman lifted her chin as he stopped at her side. Up close, he could see the tremor in her fingers, the places where she had wrapped her hands in cloth to keep the barnacle's acid from eating through to bone. "They told me a human worked here," she said, voice smaller now. "They said you take the cases when the rules say we should close the door." "They were right," Rourke said. He snapped his respirator into place and tugged on a pair of thermosleeves until they sealed against his forearms. "You did good getting him this far." He surveyed the dragon, eyes roving over clusters, searching for pattern among the ruin. "You did impossible." Behind them, administrators began to arrive, all hard edges and soft shoes, whispering the words that give cowards shelter: liability, protocol, exposure, shutdown. Rourke let their murmurs bounce off his spine and die. He turned to the staff, voice steady after a lifetime of pulling bodies away from edges. "Clear Wing C, I want negative pressure. Burn gel by the barrel, and every cutter we own sterilized twice. I want a hollow sink mapping every cluster in 3 dimensions. Get me copper mesh, bristle brushes, and a sonic scaler. We're gonna peel an ocean off a mountain." The guards looked past him to the woman, and then to the dragon, as if waiting for permission from the monster. The dragon's eye cracked open, a sunset iris surrounded by frost, and found Rourke. It searched his face like a sailor watching a lighthouse in a storm. Rourke held the gaze, and for a moment, the hall felt quiet enough to hear the moonlight touch the glass. "You're going to hate me before you thank me," he told the old sovereign, "but we're not dying on my floor." They moved. Fear stumbled after orders. Wing C coughed awake as seals slid into place and negative pressure turned the air into a river flowing inward. Rourke walked beside the woman as they wheeled the dragon through decontamination, engines roaring to life around them. "What's your name?" he asked, eyes still counting barnacles. She hesitated as if the sound had to travel from far away. "Kathy," she said then, almost shy in the shadow of catastrophe, "daughter of Aelion." Her hand hovered near the dragon's jawline, as if ready to steady him the way one steadies a legend that has outlived its songs. Rourke nodded toward the surgical bay where light pooled like mercy. "Kathy, daughter of Aelion," he said. "I'm Rourke, and I'm not afraid of your father." The doors sighed open, heat rolled out. Behind his mask he allowed himself a thin, private smile that never reached his eyes. "I only hope the plague is afraid of me." In the sealed wing, sound found new shapes. Machines hummed in tempered chords, filters sang their low metallic psalms. The dragon lay upon a lattice of reinforced carbon, the platform flexing to share his weight with the building's bones. Bright arcs of sterile light drew a boundary around the table, as if the universe had agreed to fence the battlefield. Rourke stood at the edge, knuckles resting on steel, letting his pulse slow until the tremor in his fingers flattened into the calm that had once made commanders hand him the impossible and step away. "Sedatives at microdose," he said. "We keep him present enough to breathe with us." The anesthetist nodded, hands a blur over the console. Kathy hovered beyond the line where patient becomes procedure, eyes tracking every motion with a predator's attention and a child's hope. Rourke lifted the first barnacle with a copper hook. It resisted like a fist clinging to a cliff. He slid a filament wire under the lip, twisted, and the parasite lifted with a wet pop that seemed to apologize for what it was. Underneath, the dragon's skin was a field where fires had already walked. Rourke irrigated the wound with saline, then swabbed with a burn gel he had mixed in a white bucket minutes earlier. Nothing elegant, just a brutal kindness of compounds that might put out the right kind of fire. The barnacle twitched in the forceps and tried to spit. It died when the gel kissed it. Rourke set it into a specimen capsule with others already beginning their last arguments against extinction. "Engineered," he murmured to himself. "Clever little bastard." He lifted his head. Sonic scaler. The instrument floated to his hand on a guided mag rail, purring like a bee from a childhood he hadn't had time to live. He pressed the tip to the base of the next cluster, listened to the pitch, and learned the parasite's frequency the way a musician learns a rival's song. The barnacle loosened its jaw. He eased it free in 3 patient breaths. Minutes became hours, and hours forgot their names. Rourke worked the crown and the wing joints first, places where infection becomes empire. He cut and cauterized, irrigated and soothed, drawing maps of pain on a body built to hold storms. Kathy translated the smallest of movements, bringing meaning to the dragon's quiet. "That twitch in the left foreclaw means he is warning you of a nerve path," she said. "This hiss means the pain is on the surface, not the root." She stood straighter with each instruction, her voice shaping the space so the old sovereign could keep his dignity intact while strangers took knives to his shame. When Rourke's respirator fogged, he paused only long enough to wipe his eyes clear with the back of his sleeve. When his palm split along an old scar and blood slicked his glove, he wrapped a strip of gauze around his hand with his teeth and kept cutting. "Coffee," he said once, and someone put a bulb into his free hand and squeezed so the bitter heat slid down his throat like courage in liquid form. He set the empty bulb aside and went back to war. On the 4th hour, the dragon's breath unhooked from its rattle for the first time and dropped into something that sounded like sleep, remembering itself. Kathy's shoulders sagged and then straightened as if she had been permitted one soft collapse and then recalled herself to the duty of hope. Rourke took the moment to change tactics. "We're switching to brush and gel for the crown, scalar for the wing root. No more heat there. I don't want scar tissue that makes the joints forget how to sing." The team adjusted. Cottony air moved across his cheeks as the pressure system recalibrated to his new dance. Between clusters, he angled his head toward Kathy. "Tell me how he got sick," he said, voice professional to keep the door closed on the ache that questions like this can invite. "We thought the tide blight died with the fisheries of Farron." "It did," she said, until someone taught it a new hunger. Her gaze hardened, a sun burning through fog. "They harvested spores where the old nets still rot, engineered them to love our blood. They tested on lesser kin first. When my father hid the survivors in the ice canyons, they came for him." The sentence landed like a knife put down carefully because it has cut enough. Rourke didn't look up from the wing root where a cluster sat like a black star. "Who is they?" he asked, not because he needed the answer now, but because truth gathered early can arm the future. Kathy's mouth flattened. "The ones who prefer empty skies. The ones who write laws that make mercy illegal and call it civilization." He recognized the tone. He had used it when he spoke of those who sent boys into storms and then counted medals instead of graves. By the 7th hour, the table was a map of small victories. The crown ridges gleamed with clean, raw skin under a thin lace of cooling gel. The right wing's tendon valleys were free of parasites, each one coaxed away rather than ripped out, as if he had negotiated a surrender with an army too young to know better. Rourke leaned in to work the delicate hinge, where wing met shoulder, hands steady as bridges. The instruments sang a high thread of sound. The barnacles hummed back in their dying tea. Kathy slipped a damp cloth under the dragon's jaw, speaking to him in a language that moved like wind over bone. It wasn't translation now, it was memory, a story told to anchor a mind in a room filled with knives and light. The dragon's eye opened again. Rourke met that enormous, lucid gaze and saw calculation in it, not of threat but of trust being measured against pain. "I know," Rourke said quietly, working the last stubborn edge. "I hate being touched there too." The final cluster at the hinge let go with the softest sigh. Rourke set it into the capsule with its dead kin, sealed the lid, and wiped a black smear from his cheek with the back of his wrist. He checked the monitors, heart strong, oxygen up, inflammatory markers beginning to fall like a fever, remembering the door out. He worked the brush through one last channel behind the crown, a place only another medic would think to look, and the bristles came away pink instead of black. He stepped back, and the room exhaled with him. He stripped a glove, pressed 2 fingers gently to the dragon's neck, and found a pulse that beat like a drum returning from war. Kathy's breath hitched when the rhythm steadied. She reached for his hand and stopped, fingers hovering as if his skin might break the way hope does when handled roughly. "Is he?" "He's still in a forest," Rourke said, closing his eyes for a heartbeat. "But we've cut a path. We'll keep cutting until there's sky." He turned to the team. "We cycle gel every 30 minutes for the next 4 hours. Low-dose antibiotics, not the broad-spectrum hammers. Listen to me. I want the gut flora he has to sing with ours and make the gel meaner." He allowed himself a crooked grin then, a flash of the man underneath the armor. "Let's teach this plague what happens when it picks a fight with a species that eats its problems for breakfast." At the 8th hour, he climbed a portable ladder to reach the upper crown, braced his boots, and worked there as the building thrummed around him with industry and faith. Somewhere in the 9th, his knees softened and Kathy slid under his shoulder without a word, lending him her steadiness the way one soldier braces another between bursts of fire. He finished the line he'd started, set the brush in the tray, and lowered himself onto a stool like a man agreeing to gravity for a moment. The dragon breathed. It was not the savage drag of pain. It was not the panicked gasp of drowning. It was a sound with cadence, a tide turning. Rourke tilted his head and listened as if someone had knocked on a door inside the old sovereign's chest and been answered. "That's it," he said, a whisper with edges. "That's the first good breath." He looked to Kathy and saw, at last, water gather in her eyes. She blinked it back like a warrior and nodded once, as if accepting a treaty she had prayed would find her. The machines kept humming. The gel cooled into a sheen that caught the light like frost. Rourke rolled his shoulders and reached for a fresh pair of gloves. His hands did not tremble. They had never learned how. The first thing to wake was not the dragon's eye but the room itself. Monitors that had hummed in anxious monotone began to find rhythm. The negative pressure vents softened from a tireless gale to a guided breeze. Rourke dozed in a chair he had dragged close enough that his boot touched the lattice, his chin tucked to his chest, his hands bandaged in rough stripes that made him look like he'd been arguing with a kiln. Kathy knelt with her back against the table's edge, the cloth she'd placed beneath her father's jaw gone cool and damp with night that never quite arrived under surgical lights. She whispered to him the names of frozen rivers and cliffside nesting ledges, and the 3 constellations sovereigns taught their children to follow home. Somewhere in her litany, The old monarch's breathing learned the cadence and began to keep time with her voice. The eyelid lifted like frost cracking at dawn. Crimson gold found the ceiling, then the arcs of light, then the ragged human folded into sleep at the bedside. The iris narrowed, not in threat, but in the precise focus of a mind old enough to have seen empires rise out of sand and fall back into it. Kathy felt the shift before she saw it, the way small creatures sense a storm easing. "Father," she said, the word too big for a room and too perfect to stop herself from saying. The wing nearest Rourke trembled and gathered as if testing hinges newly oiled by pain. The dragon tried to lift his head once and failed. He paused, remembered how the body listens to order only when the order is merciful, and tried again. Vertebrae rolled, tendons spoke. A low sound moved through him, deep and steady, and every person in Wing C felt it in their ribs. Alarm thresholds rushed upward, drones sent one another polite panics across silent channels. A guard in a mask blessed himself and pretended it was a diagnostic gesture. Kathy placed her palm against the ridge above her father's eye, and he stilled until the last of the tremor finished its sentence. He smelled what the Barnacles had made of him and what this room had made of them in return, and in that mingled scent he located a thin, clean seam that pointed outward. Rourke startled awake as if dragged up from a well and swatted at air until memory found him. He was halfway to standing before his body suggested, plainly without debate, that sitting would do. The dragon regarded him fully then, and Rourke met that gaze without posture or prayer. In the human's face, the sovereign found no quailing, no worship, just a professional's inventory of the living, pupils equal, breath present, 1,000-yard humor undercut by the plain arithmetic of compassion. He lowered his head until the mass of him tipped the room's balances, brought his muzzle within an arm's reach, and released a 30-centimeter thread of smoke that coiled harmlessly, as if asking a question no language had words for. "It's you," Rourke said, voice hoarse and sanded down to truth. "Stay with us." He checked the crown lines, the hinge where he'd teased the last cluster free, the wing root seam where he feared a secondary infection would make its second bid for glory. Readouts agreed with his eyes, and for the first time since the gates had groaned open, a signal of something like victory climbed up his spine. He felt Kathy's gaze on him. He nodded once to her, once to the beast, and then steadied with a hand against the lattice. The roar began small, a rolling exhale that shook a scalpel tray and sent a shiver through every sterile seal. It gathered as it moved, the way wind learns the curve of a canyon and becomes a voice with vowels. The sovereign did not pour rage into it. It was not a war cry, but history, the simple announcement of a creature returning to its name. Glass along the corridor hairline cracked, and then, in embarrassment, held. The sound left the wing, slid through ducts like a remembered hymn, and reached the atrium where orderlies had stacked fear into neat bins labeled protocol. Zareth Prime turned to listen. Dock crews paused with cargo suspended midair. A pair of schoolchildren, both too small to be out alone, looked up from a floor mosaic that had always seemed larger than them, and decided, all at once, that it no longer was. On the tribunal hill where administrators practiced their serious faces, a flock of slate-winged carrion birds started and lifted as one, then wheeled back to see what the story would be. When the last of the roar unspooled and lay quiet across the city, the dragon did the one thing no one had prepared for. He folded his front limbs awkwardly under his chest and lowered his head until the ridge of his crown nearly brushed the grit on Rourke's boots. A bow would have been too royal. This was older. The gesture of a mountain acknowledging a single lantern light that had kept its interior from becoming a grave. Kathy's breath hitched with the sound of memory closing a wound. Rourke didn't move for a heartbeat, as if his muscles feared to mistake humility for collapse. Then he touched two fingers to the cool scales between the old scar lines and murmured, not for microphones or transmissions or witness lists, but for the one who had learned to breathe again. "All right," he said, "let's teach you to fly without bleeding." The bow lasted a moment and an era. When the dragon lifted his head, the room remembered its duties and began to bustle again, but now the work moved with a new grammar. Instruments made less noise than relief does. Kathy stood taller, not because her father's shadow made a shield, but because it no longer needed to. Rourke called for microphysiosurges in the flight muscles and gentle joint cycling, nothing that would tear, everything that would remind. He refused offers to be carried to a cot and instead set his hands to the careful business of waking the body without startling it. Outside the sealed glass, administrators gathered, whispering about jurisdictions and oversight and how heroism complicated paperwork. Inside, the sovereign blinked at the world and found his daughter's face and kept it, and the medic who had wrapped human hurt around alien pain and pulled both back from a cliff felt, for the first time in a long while, that fatigue and joy could share a cup. The day did not end. It widened, and the roar's echo settled into the bones of the city, like a promise that some storms, if met with steady hands, remember how to pass. The tribunal chamber liked to pretend it was older than law. It wore pillars like armor and tinted its ceilings with the exact hue of antique virtue. Rourke sat at the center table in a jacket someone had insisted upon, and boots that still carried a dusting of gel salt no brush could persuade to leave. The charges scrolled across a vertical slate with a politeness that infuriated him. Willful breach of Interspecies Biocontainment Edict 47B. Unauthorized cross-microbiome contact. Reckless use of unregistered compounds with unknown mutagenic potential. Incitement of public disorder by means of myth. Myth, he noted, as if truth that carried 1,000 years on its back counted less than a form correctly filed. The counselors arranged themselves into a semicircle of measured disapproval. Their masks filtered air no more dangerous than their own fear. A legal advocate read the script of outrage in a voice that carried, beautifully modulated, to the corners where the cameras lurked. "Medic Rourke," the advocate said, "do you deny entering a quarantine zone with intent to conduct procedures expressly forbidden under current threat codes?" He could have said a great many things then, about codes drafted by hands that had never steadied a blade or a frightened heartbeat, but he let the simpler truth stand. "I entered a room with a dying patient," he said. "I intend to keep doing that." Kathy had not been granted a chair inside the circle. She stood beyond the cordon with a translator chip in her palm she did not need, her eyes the sharp color of air above glaciers. They had tried to keep her out entirely until the press feeds ate that decision alive. So now she was allowed to be present in the approved sense of presence, silent, visible, decorative. Rourke studied the hardness at the edges of her mouth and knew she had eaten less and slept less than he had, and had, in the algebra of grief, no plans to make up the difference later. He lifted his hand as if to scratch an old scar. She read the signal, tiny and ridiculous and human as it was, and her shoulders eased one notch. They brought experts in to dress caution as wisdom. A virologist explained, with the delicate disdain of a man who breeds terrariums for a living, how the Barnacles spores had once been marine opportunists, until famine and fear made some clever bastard hand them a new key. A security officer laid out the ways a plague can hide in victory, waiting for the banquet after the celebration. A senior counselor recited the decencies of losing someone properly versus risking everyone poorly. The audience nodded in the way audiences nod, when the truth is shaped to fit a policy and polished until it gleams like certainty. Rourke listened, because one should listen even to what one will not obey. When they gave him his turn, he did not thunder. He stood, planted his palms on the table they had made too high on purpose, and spoke as if he were delivering shift change notes to a tired team. The parasite had rewritten its appetite. It knew sovereign blood. It nested in crown ridges, tendon valleys, and anchor points, places you can't burn clean without making flight a memory. We took them one by one, taught them to let go, used gel compounded to smother rather than scorch. We kept the patient conscious so panic didn't do what parasites couldn't. We tracked vitals that tell the truth even when everyone around them is lying to themselves. And we did it behind a seal you tested 3 times because I made you. He let his gaze settle on the rows of faces. You call that recklessness. Where I'm from, we call that Tuesday. The advocate smiled the way a knife might if it had lips. And the unregistered compounds? Rourke shrugged once, a small lift of one shoulder that said he knew exactly how this sounded. I mixed burn gel with a handful of adjuncts. Some were mine. Some belonged to colleagues who won't admit it later. Some came from the patient, autologous plasma. You know what that means. Don't make me define it to make you feel taller. I'm not a chef. I'm a firefighter who sometimes has to invent water. A ripple of unwanted amusement ran through the gallery, and, just like that, half the room remembered that breathing can be a choice. The vote was supposed to be a formality made dramatic for broadcast, a roll call of names, and a cascade of censure that would end with a long suspension dressed as mercy. If they had hurried, they might even have embarrassed him before the morphine had fully let go of his bones. The presiding counselor lifted her hand to begin. Outside, the light changed. It dimmed in an instant that felt like weather deciding to become history. Every surface in the chamber looked up without meaning to look up, and the ceiling, meticulous in its theater of antiquity, glowed with a shadow crossing it that had no right to move the way a mountain moves. People who had mocked the word myth remembered why their grandparents used it like a prayer and a warning. The albino sovereign descended through the civic airspace with the indifference of a glacier choosing its valley. His wings did not beat the way lesser things beat. They unfolded and let the city fall into their cadence. He came with no escort because nothing on Zareth Prime could have escorted him without looking like a footnote. He landed on the tribunal plaza with such tenderness that the marble felt ashamed of every footstep it had ever resented. Stones shifted. Birds lifted. 1,000 cameras forgot their shot lists and simply stared. The council chamber's reinforced skylight had been rated against storms, protests, and the occasional foolish joyride by a rich child in a hover sloop. It had not been rated against a paw the size of a funeral barge pushing, very carefully, as if removing the lid from a sleeping child's toy chest. The glass bowed, decided not to fail catastrophically, and then obligingly came away in one immense pain that the dragon set on the steps like a gift he could afford to give. Wind moved across the circle with a salt-edged hush, and the smell that came with it, ice, cliff flowers, the clean aftermath of a flame that has done its job, made even the most perfumed counselor understand why the old poets had written in verbs. No one ran. To their credit, no one screamed. The sovereign lowered his head until his eye was level with the table where Rourke stood, and the iris narrowed in what any child could have told them was relief. Kathy had already found the breach and climbed, light and certain, to the broken edge. She stood between crown and chamber like a translation made flesh. The presiding counselor found her voice, because that was her skill, and addressed the dragon in the universal formal. "Your presence is irregular," she said, and somewhere a stenographer tried not to laugh. Kathy did not need the chip in her palm. She placed her hand against her father's scale and spoke in the clear register she had used as a girl to call him in from weather. "He says," she began, and the room leaned toward the ancient word, "that he remembers being carried into a place where the air itself took his weight. He remembers hands that did not tremble in the narrow places where pain makes liars of surgeons. He remembers a human who spoke to him as if he belonged to the future and not the museum of dying things." The dragon's breath washed over the circle, warm and salted, and hats that had hidden hairlines fled their perches in quiet shame. Kathy's gaze shifted to the council, to the advocate, to the cameras that would take this moment out to every portside bar and kitchen and nursery in 10 sectors. "He says, if you punish the one who returns wings to those born to carry storms, then you should prepare to love empty skies. When the real plagues come back, and they will, because hunger and fear do not retire, you will have asked the last of us to watch from far away, while your laws keep you company." Silence can be cheap when it follows cowardice. This one was expensive. It lasted long enough for every person in the chamber to do private arithmetic with their own children's names in the margins. Rourke did not bow. He did not smile either. He felt a ridiculous pressure behind his eyes, and reached up as if to rub sweat from his brow, and instead found the edge of one old scar, and his hand held there like an anchor. The presiding counselor tried to retake the script and found that scripts dislike open air. "We appreciate the testimony," she said, and even she heard the thinness of it. "Anecdote is not evidence." The dragon blinked, slowly, and turned his head just enough to bring one massive nostril close to the slate of accusations. He exhaled gently, and the display wavered, as if what it had been certain of had become, in the presence of breath, less sure. Kathy's voice softened, not to plead but to invite. He says, "You can keep your pride, we keep our dead. Today is not a day for either." She reached out, and Rourke, without planning to, met her halfway. Their fingers touched like witnesses exchanging oaths. The advocate lowered his eyes because sometimes a human thing is more subversive than a speech. No vote was taken that hour. The gavel rose and hesitated, not as if it had been carved to decide small matters and feared to break itself on a large one. The presiding counselor declared a recess in tones that promised further process and, inadvertently, admitted that something bigger than process had entered the room. Outside, the sovereign reclaimed the pane of glass, set it where it had been, and, with the grace of an elder returning a borrowed thing in better condition than he found it, sealed the chamber once more with nothing but the weight of his palm. Rourke walked out into the plaza with the slow swing of a man who has learned to carry his exhaustion instead of letting it drag him. Kathy moved at his side. The dragon lowered his crown until it was a step, and they climbed because some steps you take are not toward a door, but away from a cliff. Above them, the burned sky of Zareth cleared, and the city drew a breath it hadn't realized it was saving for a day like this. They called it a recess, but outside the chamber the world refused to pause. The plaza filled with people who had come to witness punishment and instead found a story interrupting the script. Rourke felt none of that as he rode the great white crown down to Wing Sea again, because work is honest and noise is not. He asked for the specimen tray he'd sealed in the first hours, the one with the smallest of the barnacles he had coaxed free, the one that had refused to die until it met gel, plasma, and the stubborn accidents of human biology. In the lab, the air smelled like clean heat and glass. He popped the capsule with the wet click of a mouth releasing a secret and laid the parasite beneath a scope that had cost more than his childhood town. The thing blinked in its own way, folding proteins into armor, trying 1,000 keys against a door it had invented. Rourke dabbed the gel he had mixed by feel, added the smallest measure of the dragon's autologous plasma he had siphoned with a prayer and a consent only Kathy had the right to give, and then, against every regulation neatly stacked outside the door, he touched a sterile wick to the split along his knuckle and let one red bead bloom into the mixture. Under magnification, the barnacle flexed the way cities flex during famine. The gel surrounded, the plasma recognized, and the human bacteria, country cousins to what had crawled across fish piers for millennia, did not attack. They spoke. A chain reaction unfurled in slow fireworks, receptors clogged, not by brute force, but by a conversation the parasite could not keep up with. A membrane softened, a jaw let go. Rourke watched it die without glory, the way night dies on a coast that has learned the names of dawn. He repeated the test again and again, with variations and controls, until the brisk little scientist inside him had no more objections to raise. He sent the protocol out on channels that did not wait for signatures. It went to grim-faced coastal doctors on Farron, who still kept nets in their waiting rooms like relics. To a scholar on Rix who kept secrets from her own university, because the truth had not yet passed committee. To a mechanic medic in a dust town 2 sectors over, who had saved more lives with grease under his nails than hospitals had with polished brass. He sent it to the council's own disease bureau too, because he believed in the speed of good, even when it arrived with the stamp of people who had tried to cage it. The first report came back before the tribunal could reconvene. A vault door rolled open on an ice world, and an old dragon who had not seen sky in 6 years stepped out, shaking the chains off his wings like rain. The second ping arrived from a jungle moon where a nest of hatchlings had begun to scab over with black teeth. The gel plasma blood triad set them crying, and then sleeping, and then stretching their small, bright spines as if a hand had taken their nightmares and put them into the ground. The third came not from a clinic but from a fishery ruin, where spores long asleep in salt woke to a cure that taught them how to be tired forever. The board in the lab filled with dots, and then arrows, and then wide bands that moved like weather maps when weather remembers kindness. On Zareth Prime, it did not rain water. It rained noise, roars that rolled across low neighborhoods and made dishes tremble in cupboards, laughter that came sharp and wet from people who had been careful for so long they had forgotten the sound of relief, the hydraulic sigh of hangars that had been sealed for the community's safety, opening because safety had finally arrived as a guest and not a jailer. Rourke stood in the doorway of Wing C with his hands in his pockets like a man who had stayed up too late and watched a good ending he hadn't expected to get. Kathy found him there. She had braided her hair back with a strip of gauze, as if to borrow the luck it had carried since morning. She did not speak at first. She leaned shoulder to shoulder with him and watched orderlies hustle gel buckets like altar boys carrying wine, and watched a pair of children press their faces to the glass as the old sovereign lifted a wing and allowed Rourke's physio regimen to cycle again, smoother now because pain had been made small enough for memory to carry. "He says it felt like lightning," she finally said, translating a private whisper she had been given permission to share. "Not the kind that splits a tree, the kind that strikes water and then becomes light inside it." "They'll claim it in there," Rourke said, not bitter and not surprised, just cataloging the next necessary work. "They'll frame it as the triumph of oversight." "Let them frame," Kathy answered. "Frames do not make the painting." The council reopened the chamber under a sky that had forgotten how to be gray. By then, the tide of messages had swamped their careful pace. A drab clerk tried to get control of the queue and failed because gratitude had a body count to reverse. Rural medics patched into the feed and told the room how their patients had stopped making the small, apologetic sounds of people dying as politely as possible. A dragon the color of bruised twilight pushed her muzzle into a city gate and left it there like a benediction, while the mayor sobbed into both hands and forgot to be composed. A fisherwoman lit a flare at the end of a pier that should have fallen down years ago and held it high until her arm shook, because it felt like the thing adults do when miracles go by. The vote reversed itself with a clumsy elegance that would keep political face intact if one did not look too closely. They removed censure first, as if unpicking stitches without ripping new skin, then elevated Rourke to a status with a title that sounded like it had been hammered out of a plaque. He did not kneel for it. He said yes, because the title was a lever that moved supply chains and got gel out of locked cabinets faster. He signed a sheaf of paperwork with a pen that had too much ceremony inside it, and then went downstairs to change dressings because ceremony does not keep wounds from sticking to bandage. Gifts came, because civilizations do that when they cannot think of what else would be equal to a debt. Some were absurd: a cynosure ship whose hull could drink starlight and burp out quiet, a city block deeded to him in a harbor town that smelled like knives and peaches, a piece of meteor iron carved into a coin the size of his palm that hummed if you held it to your ear. He gave most of them back with a thanks that did not bruise the giver. He kept one thing only: a scale from the Albino sovereign's crown, shed naturally in recovery, thin as rice paper and strong enough that a man could not tear it if he forgot to be careful. He carried it in his pocket like a useless tool that had nevertheless learned how to measure him. When the last of the early cures had been mixed and sent and confirmed, when Wing C had softened back toward routine and the air no longer walked in its toes, Rourke sat on the infirmary roof with Kathy and the man who swept the night shift and never asked for praise. The city below was tired in a different way than it had been the day before. It was the fatigue of work chosen, not struggle suffered. The sovereign lay along the plaza's edge with one eye open in an old animal's habit, tasting the wind that had started to bring the smell of other dragons back to him, musk and dust and the good rot of old eggshell in sunlight. "They will name it," Kathy said, nodding toward the horizon where antenna arrays blinked like lighthouses calling legislation in. "They will tie it to law so it cannot wander. They'll call it mine if it makes their job easier," Rourke said. "It isn't. You touched your blood to it," she answered. "That is ownership enough for a myth." He looked at his hands then, at the new white lines joining old ones, and found, with a sort of suspicious relief, that he felt no weight on his back that wasn't his own choosing. "I touched my blood to it because I was out of time," he said. That's not genius, that's desperation with a steady wrist. Kathy smiled in the way people smile when they witness someone renegotiating their story into a shape that fits. Desperation is how doors are found, she said. Steady is how they open. By morning, dragons were arriving from places maps had rusted off. They came cautious, as if reality might take offense, and then they came brazen, shadowing avenues and slipping between towers in patterns pilots studied with envy. Each one flew once around the infirmary and dipped at the roofline, not enough to knock anyone off their chairs, enough that you had to hold your cup still. The gesture carried no formal name. It did not need one. It said, "You are seen by those built to see from far away." Rourke did not lift his arms, did not bow, did not turn it into theater. He sat his coffee down while they went over and then picked it up again as if accepting the morning weather. A child on the neighboring roof, hair a cloud, eyes wider than any sensible boundary, copied the dragons with his little hand, dipping it anxiously, hoping to get the angle right. Rourke caught his eye and made the dip with 2 fingers, small and precise, and the boy laughed because the sky had returned his gesture. They would call the day 1,000 names. Recession Day, First Cure, the soft roaring. Rourke would call it what it was when the building emptied and the lights dimmed, and his bones reminded him that he was, after all, meat. He would call it shift change. Then he would wash his hands and go back in. They held the accord on a plateau that had been a battlefield twice and a grazing field 100 times. The ground still kept metal in it. If you walked barefoot, you could feel stubborn echoes humming under your soles, like old arguments that had finally learned to lower their voices. They built nothing permanent there for the ceremony because the point was not to own the moment, but to let it stand. The stage was a large flat rock the wind had already polished. The chairs were folding things with no status. The microphones were small, the sky did the heavy lifting. Dragons came without formation and arrived in one. Their shadows stitched a quilt over the hills and the city below. And when they settled in a semicircle that dwarfed the human one facing it, the place looked less like a summit than like a family gathering arranged by a storm. The albino sovereign stood at the center, scars faint like old handwriting across the clean map of his hide, wearing a crest band forged in the oldest style and softened by new rest. Around him, the twilight matriarch from the jungle moon, 2 iron-backed brothers from the mining belt who still had flecks of ore along their throat scales, a young blue-green scout who vibrated with unspent velocity. Their presence bent the air into something you breathed differently. Rourke wore the same jacket he had pretended to own at the tribunal because a second jacket was a kind of lie. He looked worse and better. Bad sleep had made an honest record under his eyes. Good work had emptied the brittleness from his jaw. Kathy stood to his right, not as an accessory to anyone else's power, but as the voice that had called a father back through a forest. Between them lay a table with a paper on it that could have taken 5 years to draft and had been written in 5 days because the world had refused to wait, and sometimes refusal is the best editor. They did not begin with speeches. They began with a sound the accord makers had not planned for. 1,000 throats clearing in kitchens and workshops and market squares across 10 sectors as feeds came online, and people adjusted the volume not because they feared to miss rhetoric, but because they hoped to catch a sentence that would change the way they treated strangers on a Thursday. The presiding counselor, having learned something about weather and hubris, merely raised a hand. "We are here," she said, "to admit what is true and bind ourselves to it." Kathy went first. She turned to the dragons, her voice carrying without amplification because sound remembers where it was born. "There were people who loved emptiness more than they loved the sight of your shadows on their roofs," she said. "They taught hunger to disguise itself as law. We loved our fear until it became our mirror. A human broke the mirror with his bare hands and did not cut our faces while he did it. We will keep the mirror broken." She pressed her palm to the paper, and her signature moved across it in lines that curled the way an old high path curls around a mountain because the mountain is not the enemy. The albino sovereign lowered his head until his breath stirred the signatures like wind in grass. His voice, when Kathy gave it human syllables, sounded like what rivers would say if they decided to stop being patient. "We do not kneel," he said, "because we are built to carry storms. But today, we bow to the work that does not announce itself as war. We will not hunt your children for sport, and you will not hunt ours for myth. You will not poison the waters where our young learn their bones, and we will not scorch your grain when we climb. When plagues come, and they will, because life makes bets even when the table is crooked, we will arrive early and stand long. If our shadows frighten you, tell us, and we will adjust the angle." Rourke signed last because he insisted on reading the text again with the attention of a sober man reading a contract for his friend. He added 2 lines in the margin before he put his name down. Small, stubborn edits that would have stalled a lesser gathering for months. The first obliged clinics to keep dragon plasma on hand the same way they kept type O blood. No excuses, no fees. The second required that any cure derived from sovereign biology carry a clause that gave the first 10 years of profit to the communities where the first patients had been healed. He capped the pen and gave it back to a clerk who would keep it in a case like a holy nail. The oath that followed was unplanned. A child stepped out of the crowd, the boy from the roof with hair like a stray cloud, and walked right past 3 guards who could not bring themselves to stop a small, sincere person going somewhere on purpose. He carried a brush with a wooden handle and bristles cheap enough to fall out if you looked at them hard. He stood before the albino sovereign and lifted the brush with both hands, solemn as anyone bringing bread to a table. The dragon lowered his muzzle until the scar lines across the crown were the size of roads. The child touched the brush to the healed places with a care that made adults remember how rough they had been with the world, and he said a single sentence in a clear, grave voice. "We will keep you clean." That was all. It was enough. People in kitchens put down knives and washed their hands again with a different sort of attention. A shipyard posted a sign that said, "No dumping, the sky lives here," and no one tore it down. A school on reeks added an hour to their week called tending, in which children learned to oil hinges, mend nets, and brush the places where big bodies chafe, because anything large and good in the world has vulnerable seams. The rest of the day slid by like weather that has decided to be merciful. Dancers with no training covered the rough parts in grace. An engineer from a small moon cried during a poem and then scowled at anyone who noticed. A dragon and a crane operator taught each other hand signals until the crowd laughed at the part where a 10-ton wing did the equivalent of back 2 meters. Rourke dodged interviews until Kathy ambushed him with a cup of water and a look that said, "Rest is also work." They sat behind the stage rock and watched a line of children taking turns touching one scale, one only, because they had been instructed, by example not decree, that reverence is measured in restraint. The title they had given him followed him like a polite stray. He discovered uses for it. He used it to requisition a freight run of gel precursors to a moon where supply officers had been bribed into a different kind of shortage. Used it to call an arrogant lab and make them share data with a clinic that had roofs patched with tarp. Used it to get a stubborn old ship that had flown in wars to spare its cargo hold for a week, so a teenage dragon could ride to a canyon he had been born too sick to see. When the title tried to climb into bed with him and pretend it was identity, he set it on the floor like a heavy bag and slept anyway. On the 7th day after the accord, the albino sovereign returned to the infirmary roof at dawn when the city has not yet decided what mood to wear. Rourke was up, because people with his hands wake early even when no one orders them to. The dragon did not speak first. He placed something on the roof with 2 claws and withdrew as if all the tenderness in the world were the most fragile thing it had ever tried to move. It was a ring of metal, not jewelry and not chain, forged from ship scraps and old agricultural steel, etched with the smallest of names, ports and villages and outposts that had sent messages when the cures took. Some were misspelled in charming ways. Some were in languages that looked like wind-driven script. In the center, hammered in with a tool that had left its rash of imperfections as a signature, was a sentence for the hands that did not flinch. Rourke picked it up and held it like something a child had made for him, which it was, in the sense that civilization is a child trying to impress you with its best work. He slid it up his forearm until it rested against the muscle like a promise to stay strong. He looked up at the dragon, and then at Kathy, who had arrived without footstep sound, because there are people you always know are near. "It fits," he said, surprised at the break in his voice. "I'm not sure I do." Kathy stepped closer until their shoulders touched. "You fit where you stand," she said. "Everything else rearranges around that." The city began to wake in earnest. Kitchens lit stoves. Harbor cranes lifted their first burdens. School bells attempted dignity and discovered joy. Above it all, dragons rose, one by one, not because they were ordered to, but because flight is what bodies do when they are allowed to do what they were made for. They turned once over the plateau where the paper lay under a weight that was not legal but lived, and then they spread east into the Pale. As each passed the infirmary, it dipped a wing, not choreographed, not official, simply habit now, the way a neighbor waves over a fence to the person who helped carry a sofa inside without complaining about the stairs. Rourke watched until his coffee went cold and the ring warmed to his skin. He did not say the word hero, because it is the kind of word that gets between a person and their tools. He said to no one and to the wind, "Shift starts in 5. He left the roof by the service stair, the one that creaks in 2 places if you step wrong, and he stepped right. Behind him, Kathy stood with her palms on the roof's rough ledge and looked out at everything that had almost been lost and now had a chance to be kept. She whispered the names of the 3 constellations. Sovereigns teach their children not so they can find home, but so they will know when they have left it and can turn, if they choose. The albino dragon angled into the light and was briefly a white spear, briefly a cloud shredded by its own joy, briefly a memory and a promise at once. Across the sectors, in kitchens and markets and mines, people lifted their heads when a shadow crossed the ground and felt, without instruction, a small, precise impulse traveled down their arms and into their hands, the impulse to brush, to tend, to keep. And somewhere in a room that had once been too quiet to think, a human medic washed his hands, dried them, and reached for the next pair of gloves.